Howdy shipmates, I'm Captain Dan. Welcome once again to Story Time with Captain Dan. How are we all doing? Hope you're well. I'm trying to bring a bit of cheer to us all with some classic stories and some modern stories, story time really. If you have any favourites, please let me know. If you want me to dedicate any to you, please do let me know. Today I'm returning to another personal favourite of mine, the Mr. Men series. And this special episode is dedicated to a very good friend of mine, a man called Adrian, who's a big fan of the Mr. Men series. A lovely little boy, Adrian. He does lots to try and help others and cheer them up. Now, I know it's not his favourite story because really maybe I'll share those stories a little later, but today's story is going to be Mr. Bump. So it's Mr. Bump from the Mr. Men series by Roger Hargreave. Here we go. This is a sad story of Mr. Bump. And here he is. The trouble was that Mr. Bump just could not help having little accidents. If there was something for Mr. Bump to bump into, he'd bump into it all right. For instance, if you were to see Mr. Bump out walking down a street in your town, and if there happened to be something to bump into down that street, then you know what would happen, don't you? You can see it. Bump! Oh, Mr. Bump. Mr. Bump was just the same at home. He lived in an extremely nice house. But even there, he couldn't help having those little accidents. For instance, one morning when Mr. Bump went outside his house, he noticed that the chimney pot had come loose in a storm the night before. "I must fix that before it falls down," thought Mr. Bump to himself. And he hurried to his garden shed to fetch a ladder. It was a very long ladder. Mr. Bump walked up the garden path with the ladder on his shoulder. He turned the corner of the garden path and crash went the living room window. "Oh dear," thought Mr. Bump, and he turned to see what had happened. Crash went the kitchen window behind him. "Oh dear," thought Mr. Bump again, and he rested the ladder against the wall of the house so he could climb up on the roof to mend the chimney pot. Crash went the bedroom window. Oh dear, oh dear. So you can see how Mr. Bump had his little accidents. Mr. Bump had had many jobs, but somehow they never seemed to last very long. As soon as anything got lost or broken or splintered or chipped or snapped or cracked or torn or burst or wrenched or crunched or split or slit, poor old Mr. Bump got the blame. For instance, when Mr. Bump worked on a farm, he tripped over the farm dog and spilt the milk which was carrying for the farmer's wife and which the farm cat lapped up. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a postman, he got his hand stuck in the pillar box and they had to fetch the fire brigade to come and get him free. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a bus conductor, he fell off the bus and couldn't catch up with it again, and all the passengers travelled without having to pay. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a carpenter, he found that when he was hammering nails, he hammered his thumb most of the time, and never a nail hardly ever went in. Poor Mr. Bump. In order to recover from this series of rather unfortunate happenings, Mr. Bump decided to take a holiday. There he could think about what sort of job he could do where he wouldn't be such a nuisance to everybody. So he set off to the station to catch the train to the seaside. While Mr. Bump was on holiday, several things happened. For instance, he fell off a boat into the sea. And the lifeboat had to come to rescue him. For instance, one day when he was quietly walking along the beach, minding his own business, he got his foot stuck in a bucket and he couldn't get it off. He had to walk around with it on his foot for hours and hours and hours. Poor Mr. Bump. For instance, another time he was walking along the beach. He walked straight into a large hole that somebody had dug, and he had to stay there all night because the poor Mr. Bump couldn't climb out on his own. However, despite all these little accidents, Mr. Bump enjoyed his holiday. And while he was there, he had a splendid idea about what sort of job he should do. It was quite the best idea Mr. Bump had ever had. An absolutely splendid idea. Splendid, I say. And now Mr. Bump works happily for Mr. Barley, the farmer. Mr. Barley has a large apple orchard on his farm, and that is where Mr. Bump works. Mr. Bump's job is picking apples, but he doesn't use a ladder to climb up the tree to pick the apples like other apple pickers. Oh no, Mr. Bump has a much better way of picking apples than that. He just walks about. And before long, Mr. Bump, being Mr. Bump, walks into a tree. Bump! And down falls an apple, and Mr. Bump catches it. That makes the job of apple picking much easier, and Mr. Bump is very pleased about his new job, and Mr. Barley is very pleased about his new apple picker. So you see, the story of Mr. Bump isn't such a sad story after all. And if you ever bump yourself, you know what to do, don't you? Go and eat an apple picked by Mr. Bump, and then you won't feel the bump at all. Even if it's an apple falling on your head. You remember that next time you have a bump, won't you? Good. So that's enough for today. That's the last of today for story time with Captain Dan. I'd just like to wish you a very good night before I enjoy this lovely apple. So good night, oh sweet repose. Don't lie on your belly, because you might squash your nose.